Wholeness means to me being in a state of joy.
Wholeness means feeling complete, owning my authentic gifts.
Wholeness is really connected. Everything is connected to everything.
Wholeness is where we have access to all parts of ourselves.
This conversation with Kimberly was really eye-opening. She is a licensed clinical social worker. She's a therapist. She sees clients. She's also trained as a level 3 IFS psychotherapist, which is Internal Family Systems by Dr. Richard Swartz. I talk about it all the time. I love the understandings of IFS. I highly recommend learning all you can about it. But she was so vulnerable in this conversation about her own addictions and her own interaction with spirituality and how she uses that with her clients. I think it's a really good conversation, and I can't wait for you to hear it.
Jokingly tell people that I've had about 15 careers, not jobs, careers. But you know, I became a psychotherapist after a lifetime of trauma, addiction, abuse. And I think so many of us come from that background. And for those of us who survive it, right, there's an aspect of resilience, and there's something that we find. We find something. I don't think I've met a psychotherapist or survivor of trauma or addiction who doesn't have something, right, that has then informed the rest of their life. Right. So I am a person in long-term recovery. My sobriety date is November 27th, 1994. So I just celebrated 29 years. I am a former drug addict. I don't know the exact date, but it was May of 1981 that I discontinued because I got a bad batch and the walls were melting, and that was the end of that for me.
Wow.
Wasn't quite sure what I got, right? And as a result, it just scared me straight, literally. But I kept drinking, and I have, my drinking career began when I was 2 years old. Oh, wow. My parents moved to the south of France, and I was hanging out as they were remodeling and rebuilding an old farmhouse, and the landscaper and all around person that was helping my dad was a great big burly Italian man who took his lunch under one of the trees with a salami and the bread and a bottle of wine. And I would hang out with him, and he'd break off a little piece of bread and cheese and some salami, and then he poured me a glass of wine. And I said, drink, right? And so I did. Right. At age 2. I don't know what my parents were doing or where they were, but, right. Oh well. And that set the tone for the rest of my life. Right. And until it became not just an amusement, but it became a necessity for me to exist. November 27th, 1994 was my moment of enlightenment. It was my moment of surrender. It was my moment of asking for help from above, right? And ironically, despite the drinking and the drugs, I had for my whole life just felt this sense of something else or someone else that, one of your guests called it that spark, I always have referred to it as the divine within me. And even as a little kid, we moved around a lot in Europe. And at one point we were living in London. There was a church at the end of the block. I couldn't have been more than, say, 6 or 7 years old. Don't ask me what possessed me. I walked out of the house, walked down the street, went to the church, walked in, and sat in the back pew with the hats, right? That they're British, right? Yes. They have the top hats. And that's, if the parents wanted to know where I was, right, that's where they'd find me.
Wow.
I was sitting in the back pew of a church, hadn't a clue what was going on up front. but I just felt this incredible peace and belonging, and that this was safe, right? And probably that was because it wasn't safe inside where I lived. You know, it was very beautiful on the outside. Everything was glorious and elegant, but on the inside, it was really ugly. So I think probably that attraction was one of, if you are out there, right, I know where to go so that you'll come and be with me, right? It's out of, again, a very young age, very odd thing to have happen. So when I did surrender, and I looked heavenward, and I just said, please, you've got to help me. I can't keep doing this. I can't. I just can't. My life is falling apart. And this is like the last time I want it to fall apart. It had fallen apart a lot of times, so this is the last time, right? Yeah, right. We just have this as the last time,
right?
And you know, and so 2 days later, I walked into a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous, and I never looked back. I never looked back. And so 29 years later, right? What was ironic is that I was in the middle of my first semester of my master's program in social work. And so, you know, I didn't have a problem, right? But I'm going to be a social worker and help people with problems.
Right.
Yeah. And so long story short, I finished my master's. I attempted to get a PhD at University of Southern California, which did not pan out. But it led me to come to Washington, D.C. and look for a job because I had student loans to pay off. And, you know, as will happen in this area, you start one thing and you end up doing something else. I mean, it's typical. Anybody you meet up here in the D.C. area will tell you, yeah, I came here for one thing and now look at me, I'm doing something else, you know. And that's what happened to me. I ended up working as a White House appointee. I was a specialist in welfare reform. I worked in child support enforcement at the federal level, and then I transitioned to the Department of Defense, doing communications and all of that sort of thing. And I was in the middle of a meeting in IT knowledge management. And I looked around at, you know, guys with their things on their lapels and, you know, things hanging from their chest, and all very, you know, weighty and impressive folk and people I respected. But I said to myself, what am I doing here? This is not where I belong. You know, and it was that still voice in my head, you know, that the one that said, go to the church on the corner, you'll be safe there. You know, it's that same kind of voice. And so that night, you know, early days of the internet, but lots of information was on there. And so I just grabbed everything I could, you know, how do I get back into what I, you know, pursued in terms of education, and found a program for certification for addiction, to become an addiction counselor. And in that process, worked with someone who was an LCSW and said, listen, you know, you can get an LSW, you know, and get your foot in the door. And I'm like, really? Who knew? You know? So I started this very, very fast track to get back to where I wanted to be, which was to help people, not help people through, you know, new IT applications, help people individually, you know.
Right.
Yeah. Wow. So I did all of that. I knocked off thousands of hours while I was doing a full-time job. So, I mean, it was nothing for me to just exist on 4 or 5 hours of sleep a night. You know, I go to my night internship, come home exhausted, study first thing in the morning, go to work. Yeah, it was crazy, but I was younger and I had more energy. And I was also bound and determined, you know. I was like, this is it, you know, this is the other, you know, chance of my life, right? And I have to do it now. And so I did. And so little by slowly, I learned what not to do during my internships and my early jobs. And I really culled and cultivated an awareness through research. I'm a natural researcher, but through my research, cultivated an awareness that the way we were I was working in the field of addiction, obviously, but the way we were doing this wasn't exactly working.
Mm-hmm.
And we had a lot of relapses, and we had a lot of pushback, and, it's not working, people.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that was, inpatient, detox, outpatient. I worked for quite a few years in the field.
Mm-hmm.
And I finally said, no, I'm going to go private. Let me go private. Let me see if I can do this, start my own practice.
Mm-hmm.
And by virtue of that, let me see if I can do it differently.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so I started to approach treating addiction and by extension, anxiety, depression, trauma differently, very differently. I came from the school of, classic cognitive behavioral therapy. Think your way out of something. I'm not so sure about that.
Right.
Because of the nature of trauma and the nature of addiction, right? Those voices in your head are a little louder than think a rational thought. Right. So in my experience, right. And in my clients' experience. So long story short, maybe even shorter, I discovered internal family systems and worked with a therapist as a client. I was so blown away that, like, within several sessions, I said, okay, I need to know everything I can about this. This is what I want to do, right? And it was as if everything in my life sort of came into that one moment, right? Of just, oh, okay, that's it. This is the trajectory. This is the one. This is the solution. I'm not alone here. There is another way to do this, right? And it can be applied across the board. Addiction, anxiety, depression, right? Trauma. And that was it. I started taking one training after the other, and reading every single book available. I'm now a level 3 IFS, which there are 3 levels. I've achieved that. I'm going through the process of certification. It's tough. Boy, is it tough. Ooh, and I'm hoping, praying that I'll get through it in the next few months. And I have a private practice of thriving, and I use IFS as my only model. That's it. What's interesting is that in the process of learning IFS and going through that, meantime, I'm holding my spiritual practices that I was teaching clients. Right? When I had a physical office, I had a yoga mat on the floor. I had a meditation cushion. I had, sound bowls. I had all this stuff, and suddenly these 2 worlds just went like that. So as a result of that, and this was now 12 years ago, 10 years of research and accumulating knowledge and training, 4 years of writing, 2 years working with an editor to produce a manuscript to completion. And on April 24th, 2024, this year, my book comes out.
Yeah.
And that is Rise and Recovery, the Spiritual Path for Healing Addiction. And in it, I talk about spirituality, about neuroscience, and how it dovetails with spirituality. And that brings us to today. Here I am.
Wow. So I hear a couple of things that you talked about. And so what comes to my mind is, like, there's this idea of spirit, and then there's this idea of spirituality. Are they different for you, or how do you describe spirituality, and do those things just overlap completely? There's a lot of people say they like spirituality, but I don't know how comfortable they are with spirit, or vice versa, that kind of thing, where spirit, they're happy to be spirit, have the spirit with them, or be with spirit, but then the spirituality side, the singing bowls and those kind of things feel kind of,
model
a little
for
beyond.
process.
Do you know what I mean? So
I do.
I do.
I do, and I talk a lot about it in my book because I've come up against this in as working with clients who have addictive processes, right? one of the first things traditionally, they go, okay, well, let's get you to a 12-step meeting, right? No way, right? I'm not doing that God thing.
Right.
And so right away, we're up against something. And
Right.
so I really learned and discovered that, okay, wait a minute. We're not talking religion. We're not
Right.
talking, that you have to go to church or you have to believe in God. No. Right? That's a whole different separate conversation.
Right.
But if we can come to the place of agreement that there's something in there, right? There's something inside me that makes me.
Yeah.
Right. I think Eckhart Tolle calls it, I forget what he calls it, like the presence of now, so many people call it so many different things, right? But there is, Michael Singer talks about it, the eye that knows the eye is here, that kind of thing, right? So, we can look at, and I think we can all agree, there's something inside me that makes me who I am. Right. And makes me unique and individual. And so therefore, if we come to a common definition, a common word that everybody can pretty much agree on, it's self. Oh, I have myself, but I have myself, capital S. And that self has specific qualities. Right. Now in IFS, we have 8 C's. Actually now 9 C's. I've added another one to 10 C's. And Richard Schwartz is great. He says, just add on as many C's as you want, whatever the qualities are.
Great.
But we have our core C's, right? And they are calm, centered, connected, curious, creative, compassionate, courageous, confident. The other C is choice. We have choice.
That's great.
Beautiful one. Beautiful one that was brought in by an incredible trainer, CSAC, incredible. And then I've added certitude, because certitude is that condition, that state of being where I know what I know, and there's no doubt in my mind. There's no agenda, but there's no doubt in my mind, right? There's that. Right? So self, if we just call it that, is this entity, right? Now, is it for a Christian person, it might be, oh, that's the Holy Spirit within me, right? For a Catholic, they might say, oh, that's the heart of Jesus within me, right? Or, for someone in the Judaic faith, oh, that's Nishma, right? Or if someone is in Islam, oh, it's, so there are all these words we ascribe to the spirit. Right. But it's not necessarily what we're talking about when we talk about self. Right. So, and I have no problem if someone wants to call it the Holy Spirit, they can call it whatever they want. Right. But for the atheists and the agnostics who I work with, that's not going to work. So, so it's like, okay, can we agree on self, that self has these qualities? Does that land for you? Oh yeah, of course that lands, right? Great. Then that's all we have to do. That's it. That's where, we're trying to go to, right? To, as I say, let's strengthen the muscle a bit there, go to it more than others, right? Other areas of ourselves. And so spirit, it is really a personal choice. Spirituality is the concept of being connected to a self energy within that is unlimited in its resource. There's no end. No end to it. It is the universe inside you, right? And that has no end. So, we are a particle of that greater whole. And even an agnostic or an atheist can say, yeah, I get that. That's cool. I got that one. Right. So I remove religion. I remove, if it's necessary, right? However, I'm well versed in multiple religions, so I can speak to everyone. Right, not a problem. But it's not a have to. You don't have to believe in God to be spiritual.
Right. I often think like the physical. One way I try and help people understand is like if we think of something physical, it's just spiritual is just the opposite of that. It's non-physical. It's this. It's like we know it's there, but I don't see it, touch it, feel it, or like tangibly feel it.
That's right.
And that's a simple.
Exactly.
It's so simple. It's simple, but and people you can grab onto that, and that makes sense to people. People know what that's all about. And with IFS, I love that big S self because it is that being in that state of the big S self. What I hear you say is expanding that time we spend with all those C's. So if you're not familiar with IFS, we have explain that a little bit. I'll let you explain it since you've done the training and Richard Swartz is just an amazing. He's so humble and he's been working for so many years, and all of a sudden it's become
so long.
So being used more often, being understood more often, and it's so great to have these, to understand that we are a sum of parts. So explain a little bit about IFS and what that means.
Of course, thank you. I can't speak highly enough of Richard. I met him. I recently worked with him. I'm in awe, right?
Yeah.
And I think most of us are just like gobsmacked, right?
Yeah.
But then when you're with him in person, or even over the airwaves, it's just like he doesn't exude any ego. He's just totally himself. So this process developed as a result of his own curiosity, but also working with very extreme kinds of clients.
Mm-hmm.
And the story is well written in many, many books that he has written. So I'm not going to, mush it up right now. But what is IFS? IFS looks at the human existence not as a uni-person, but as a multi-dimensional, multifaceted entity. And the way I explain to clients is just think about, do you ever have a conversation with yourself when you're driving down the road? Of course you do. Don't forget the laundry, and then you got to do the dinner, and don't forget to tell husband. Right. So those are parts of you, right? They're parts of you. And you can have entire arguments in your head. You can run a laundry list in your head, right? A to-do list in your head. That's that's a part of you too.
Right.
And then there's the part of you that so wants to go to that party. Oh, I get to see all my friends and hang out, but I just want to be home in my pajamas. Another part of me, right?
Right.
So this part wants to go. This part wants to stay in the jammies. Then there's, we have our roles in our life, right? Mother, wife, sister, therapist, whatever, it goes on, friend, colleague, and the list goes on to the roles that we have in our life. Those are parts too. So as we start to look at all these different parts, like, oh, there are a lot of parts of us here.
Yes.
We're not just this solo single thing. And what he began to discover was, and it's really his clients were telling him, and then he was piecing together things over time. But what came out was, well, a part of me is, very much, it's protecting, and this is protecting too, and this is protecting. So he discovered, these protectors have very distinct roles. This one operates as the managers operate with a mantra, with a motto. Right? We will never let something happen again.
Mantra.
No matter what. We are never going to let this happen again. So maybe something happened in your childhood, and that manager stepped forth and said, okay, we're never letting that happen again.
Right.
And then proceeds to take on a role to make sure that doesn't happen again. Right. The other protector, he calls the firefighter. And that firefighter has a motto, a mantra, and it's don't feel at all cost. No feeling,
Right.
no emotion, right? No emotionality. Just push it down.
Right.
So what does the firefighter do? Oh, well, let's numb it out.
Mm-hmm.
Let's drink. Let's eat sugar. Let's shop. Let's have sex. Let's gamble. Let's be outrageous. Anything not to feel, right? But also we will soothe with alcohol, we'll soothe with food, right? We don't want to feel those feelings, right? But the moment this happens, these guys get really upset over here. These managers like, hell no, that's not going to happen again.
Right.
And the next thing you know, you've got this real internal battle, which Dick calls a polarity, right? So you're at polar opposites between a set of parts. And the next sort of logical question is, well, who are they protecting? You know, who are these protectors protecting? And as he started to discover, these very active parts of us are protecting the vulnerabilities within, the parts that hold shame, the parts that hold loneliness, the parts that hold fear, the parts that have, you know, we're abandoned, we're abused, we're maltreated, we're teased, we're bullied, all of that. I mean, the list goes on and on and on of what those parts hold, right? And the pain is so great. Right. So the moment of an exile gets triggered, like, oh, no, please don't leave me. Right. Boom. A part comes and goes, okay, that's it. I'm taking over here. Right. And proceeds to then literally play out in our lives. And it's not conscious. We just suddenly, I mean, you know it when you're in it, right? And how many times have we encountered, I don't know, an authority figure and immediately bristled, or and gotten in their face, or an authority figure comes into our life and goes, anything you want, right? Oh, okay, that's your parts are reacting, and they're protecting whatever is in here. Either it's a fearful, okay, don't hurt me, or it's like, you're not going to tell me what to do, like that adolescent part, right?
Right.
So as we get to know, as we explore and get to know these parts, we start to have an opportunity to connect with them, and then to really get a clarity about it, right? One of the C's, connecting, getting clear. We have creative ways of doing that. So there's a creative aspect to it. And we have a lot of compassion because we start to hear their stories.
Right.
And parts, for the most part, parts have never been able to tell their story. They feel unheard, right? So when parts start to feel heard, feel acknowledged, get to tell their story and receive compassion and acknowledgement and appreciation, they just step back and say, this is who I'm protecting, right? And then we start to work with those wounded parts, right? And ultimately what is called unburdening, right, is being able to literally remove the weight of traumas of the past, right? And it's an energetic removal, if you will. What is interesting to me, I'm very interested in quantum physics, and how spirituality and quantum physics intersect. And I recently heard Dick Schwartz talking about how when we go back and connect with those exiles, there is sort of a quantum energy that occurs where there's point and wave, right? You can't change the past.
Yeah.
You cannot change what happened to you. But we can change our relationship to that and help that part to say, okay, I don't need this anymore. I don't need that holding on to it for dear life anymore and letting it go. And when that happens, then we can take in very positive qualities, very nurturing qualities. And that exile then really starts to thrive and heal. Right. So I hope I haven't mushed it up too much, right? Yeah. But that's sort of the encapsulated IFS, right? It is, and it's evidence-based. So it's not just, some sort of pie in the sky. When I was at the IFS conference in Denver this year, there was a fascinating gentleman, neuroscientist from Harvard, who spoke for a couple of hours about all the research that Harvard is doing using IFS and brain scanning, and I mean, really rigorous science, right?
Wow.
And the conclusions and the evidence is really like mind-blowing.
Wow.
So there's a lot of, I think part of the buzz about this is because clients and therapists are experiencing relief. But the second level of buzz or excitement, you know, is that we have some very serious researchers that are looking into this also at Stanford, Harvard, a couple of other universities, major research going on, investigating, looking at what's going on here, what's happening exactly. Because not only is there an emotional release, but there's a physical release as well.
Yeah.
And that's huge.
Yeah, that's amazing. I know. I think he developed IFS, isn't it 40 plus years ago? Did they just have
over 40?
Yeah.
They just had the 40-year celebration in Denver. So over 40 years he's been at this.
Yeah. And it makes so much sense.
Determination.
Yeah, it makes so much sense. If anybody, you know, so there's the first part of it is just understanding that we have these parts, and anybody, like you said, anybody that makes a decision, you're going to meet your parts, even if it's just, should I go to the movie? Part of me wants to. I mean, rarely is it just 100% go. You know, it's like part of me wants to. And just by opening up that for myself, just by allowing myself to have a part that really wants to and a part that doesn't want to, sometimes I feel like we have to just push one away, you know, but it's like, look, I actually have two ideas here, and allow them both to exist. And then I can make a choice so much more clearer because I'm allowing both to live fully. You know, I'm allowing both to exist at the same time. So just even without all the issues, you know, let alone the issues that it helps you deal with, but just understanding the basic concept of we have parts, there's parts of us, you know, and we'll say it, part of me wants to, part of me doesn't. When you start to become conscious and aware of how many times that we speak that way, it's really fascinating actually, how often that is who we are. And I sometimes in that struggle is where the struggle really is, you know. And think about working with your child. They want to be obedient. They don't want to get in trouble, but they want to do what they want to do. There's two parts at work, right? The part that wants to obey and the part that wants to do their thing. And when we can see that and recognize that maybe in young children, it kind of changes the dynamic of how I work with them, you know, like changes the way I show up when I recognize that there are they're not just trying to be disobedient. And, you know, I was talking to my son, we were having a great conversation the other day. And I said, one of the hardest questions that parents ask their kids is, what were you thinking? Because there is no answer, right? Like, what is the answer to those kinds of questions? What were you thinking? If you get into that idea of what were you thinking, you're going to go right into IFS type stuff. If you really unburied what you were thinking, you're going to have all these different parts at play, and it's so much more complex than just that idea of what were you thinking. It's so much more. And so I've loved reading about IFS and recognizing that. The other part is just, like we said before, I've created a graphic, and I'll try and put it in the notes of the podcast because I just took that true self. I want to redo it now because I love these two other words that's been added, but I just made a list of all those C words because that is such the barometer about whether I'm in my ego, whether I'm hearing someone else that I'm with, whether I'm triggered, you know, like it's such a distinction between whether I'm in that self that just, it's just things are at ease, right? Like there's not a huge problem in the world.
Yeah.
So how
I
does
love
that?
what you're saying, Michelle. Yeah, I love what you're saying because, one of the speakers at the conference, and forgive me because I can't remember everybody's name, but
Right.
and I'm more than happy to get you these names for your notes, but um, is working IFS in the school systems and teaching children parts language, being able to
Yes.
identify, well, part of me, wants to hit Tummy over the head because, he
Right.
took my backpack.
Right.
So part of me is mad at him. So I'm going to take my shoe and bop him one. Well, when children can start to identify those parts and what their characteristics are, right? It's phenomenal teaching and learning because all parts are welcome and there are no bad parts.
Yeah.
And that's the premise that we begin with, right?
Mhm.
So even the part of me that wanted to hit, Tommy over the head with a shoe, it's not a bad part that it wanted to hit Tommy, but all behaviors are not always welcome.
Right.
So children get to learn that it's okay that I want to,
Right.
This part of me really wants to, but I'm not gonna because I know that, that wouldn't be good. Right. So there's a wonderful expansion for children and room to be, right? Yeah, it really is beautiful. So not only are you observing in your children the parts, right? But as we speak with in parts language with children, then our system and their system is starting to
Yes.
think, right? And that becomes very beautiful. So, using, in fact, I'm about to launch into yet another training about IFS in relationship, right? So intimacy from the inside out, right, is the basis of that. The book is of the same name, and it's taking IFS to the next level for me at least, and that is relationship, right?
Yes.
Relationship. How do I recognize the parts in my husband? Who's up right now? How if I'm in self, I automatically see that he's like, he eventually, no matter what his mood is, he'll just suddenly turn around and go, oh yeah, what's going on? Yeah. Right.
Yes.
So there's a recalibration very quickly, and speaking, for a part, instead of from a part, where it's highly triggering, right? Highly triggering,
right?
So
much.
Yeah. So it's so much. It's so much, and it has such unlimited possibility, right?
Yeah.
I wish that we could use IFS in the peace talks right now.
Yes.
I wish that we could, bring IFS to, Congress and the Senate. There are so many places where it can be used, not as some woo-woo thing, but as a very legitimate means of communication and dynamic and interaction. Yeah.
Right. Because when we understand where we're coming from, and when we understand that someone else is going to come from a different place, then we meet in the middle with communication instead of from maybe you could even call them our biases or the things we've had to develop, in our lives. It's really helpful to understand that. One of my favorite books, I think it's Dr. Richard Swartz. You're the One You've Been Waiting For. Have you read that book of his?
Yes.
That book, the dynamics of a relationship, especially a couple relationship. I think he describes you could just check box all the things you need to understand relationships in that book. And so fascinating, so fascinating. I highly recommend it. I've got to put that in the notes as well.
Put that in the notes. And that's forming the basis of this, like taking it to another level.
Yes. So that's going to be a great training, because I think, once we understand our big S self, then we know how to bring it out in other people and how to recognize when you're out of it. And because when we're out of it, we're just causing a lot of chaos, especially in relationships, right? Especially in our relationships, let alone within ourselves. Yeah.
100%, because, you know, when we're in, when the parts are leading, right, when we're blended with our parts, which means basically just that the parts have glopped onto you. I mean, I literally, I've had clients say, God, it feels like I've got glue on me.
Yes.
You know, yeah, your part is completely blended with you.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And so when we are able to unblend, you know, from those parts, and self starts to lead, self, you know, doesn't have an agenda. So it's just going to wait patiently until a part can turn around and go, would you take on this one? Because I just can't anymore.
Yes.
Right? And so it's like, yeah, sure, no problem. I'm calm, I'm centered, I'm curious, I'm clear, I'm here. And self is so much the flow. Right. It is the wave of quantum physics. It is the wave. Right. And we know when we're in flow.
Right.
We know it. And so, yes. So being in self more and more and more, right? Learning how to be there. It's a game changer for the rest of our life. It really is. And what's, to me, particularly fascinating is exactly what ancient Eastern scriptures talked about 5,000 years ago. Right. So, guess what? You know,
here we
guess
go.
what? Yeah, here we go.
There was some understanding they knew that was not physical. They were good at understanding non-physical things. And it's time for us to kind of move back and learn from that model. And when I heard you say that, you know, sometimes there's a physical release. And I just want you to know, when my husband read No Bad Parts, probably about almost a year ago at this time, you know, he has a watch that tracks his, you know, his blood pressure, and he's been on blood pressure medication, and his blood pressure, there was particularly one part he worked with through that book, because Richard walks you through, especially in the audio version, he walks you through some IFS, and his blood pressure literally came down. He could feel it. He could feel it in his body, and he will be the one that tells you, like, things have changed. He's kind of recognized those parts, and they, you know, to him, they have their own name. They have their, he knows when they developed, what their job is, when they come into play, how it feels in his body when that part shows up. And it's amazing. And he was one that, you know, was probably a little hesitant about those things, but yet you can't deny it when you experience that, the relief of those periods of time. It's so, I love it. He's cataloging his parts, right? He's tracking his parts and cataloging his parts. Beautiful. And yes, our physical body holds that trauma, holds the effects, right? So when we're able to unburden and release and get to do the whole process, then we, you know, the body responds, right? You know, I have a client who, actually, I have a few clients who have fibromyalgia and have come to me, like, you know, practically crippled, but, you know, really bad, couldn't walk up and down stairs, couldn't open doors, you know, shoulders somewhere up around, you know, near their ears, right? And over time, as we released and released and released, I have one client who literally could not walk up and down the stairs, could not. Right. And had to get help for basic things like getting the groceries up to her apartment. Really traumatic. And she now is going up and down the stairs by herself. She's taking her garbage out by herself. She's getting her groceries up to her house by herself. And she's thriving, thriving. Right. And that's just one example of many clients who have experienced this release, you know. So that's amazing.
A huge capacity of healing, right? And again, you know, this is going back to that, the spiritual aspect of it. You know, the ancient scriptures spoke that if you do this, you do that, and you do the third, then you will have optimal health, right? But if you're not doing that, then you will suffer, right? And the suffering occurs, according to the Buddha, the suffering occurs within our own mind, right? And you could say, oh, that mind is filled with all of the personalities of my parts.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what's creating the suffering.
Right.
But if we touch ourself and get there, right, the suffering, it just disappears, it melts. Right. And if nothing else, as I tell a lot of my clients, a lot of the pain will soften at the edges. Right? Will start to soften at the edges. And when that happens and we're experiencing that softening, that gives us a great amount of hope. And hope is what then will keep our system going to, to continue.
Right.
And this, I think IFS is a huge model. I mean, it is the message and model of hope.
So what does it look like in a session when you use the singing bowls, when you bring in the spirituality? How does that work?
Well, I don't use the singing bowls anymore because I don't have an office like that anymore. COVID sort of put the kibosh on that.
Oh, shoot.
But yeah. But so so now what I do is, there's several things that I do. The first thing I do is I check with clients on how are they breathing. And in fact, I was just working with a client the other day, and high anxiety, really high anxiety, very high ADHD, high anxiety. And I don't know how we got into this conversation. Oh, I know, because he was saying, damnedest thing, I keep yawning, and it's like, big yawning, and then I'm gasping for breath. And I said, guess what? You're a shallow breather. You're breathing up here, right? You're not breathing in your lungs. He said, what the hell are you talking about? I breathe, And I'm like, no, you don't breathe. And that's why you're yawning, gasping for breath. So in Sanskrit, this is known as pranayama, breath, breath practices. And there's an entire science around pranayama. There's research that's been conducted around breath and what breath does to the body. Books have been written on it. And I'll give you one book that is one of my favorites, by Nestor Torres. Amazing book, Breath, The Lost Science of the New Art of a Lost Science. Right? Beautiful, beautiful book, Breath, and which I just ate up. But it's grounded in practices over 5,000 years. So how do we breathe? So I teach my clients how to breathe.
Wow.
And you're not breathing from up here. You're breathing from down here. This is where your lungs are. They're like, it is? No, it's down here, right?
Right.
And you're breathing with your abdomen, right? You're not breathing.
Right.
That's not. Right. This is your bronchia.
Yeah.
I'm really very descriptive, if you will, and I will show them, and then I will have them do it with me. Right. Okay, let's breathe. So that's just how do you breathe in and out, right? Okay. And you're doing it through your nose, not your mouth. Okay. Then I may teach them particular and specific breathing techniques depending on what's needed. I have no energy. Okay, we're going to teach you a breath technique that will stimulate some energy. I have too much energy. Here's the calming technique. I have too much anxiety. Then we're going to use this technique. And then I'll just let them know, look, I'm going to recommend that you do this every single day for 3 to 5 minutes. When you're driving, do this so that you don't get, a panic attack while you're driving. Right. And before you go to sleep, since you're having trouble sleeping, try this technique. And, so that's just breathing. Right? I usually start at some very early in the session. I will start with, let's just go inside, right? Usually a client will say, yeah, I just had something happen. I'm really pissed off, or I'm really upset, or what have you. Well, let's take a moment. It's okay to just take a moment. Let's go inside, right? Get that outside external stimulation and vibration to just sort of fade. And go in here with our breath and just come into present moment. So now what have we just done? We've come inside into the present moment, focusing on our breath. We've just literally reduced the sympathetic nervous system and increased the parasympathetic. And a whole bunch of neurochemicals sort of having a happy dance in our body, right?
Right.
So that's just the beginning, you know. I will also teach clients mantra, specific Kundalini mantra for calming, for centering, right? I have one client who doesn't like to meditate, but he's a runner. And so when he runs, he uses a Kundalini mantra for his running, for focus, right? And it's working beautifully for him. And he's finding that he's much less anxious during the day.
Wow.
As a result, right?
Yeah, right.
And you know, the mantras are seed syllables, right? They're roots, they're root of cosmic sound. So very powerful. In some of the retreats that I host, I'll teach longer, entire, chanting stanzas and what have you. And then, someone has something concrete to take with them. There's a world of Spotify playlists on mantras out there, right? So we can always look them up. But what if a client is a devout Christian? A mantra from India, that's like, no, right? I'm not doing that. You're absolutely right. Of course not. I respect that entirely. So let's choose a hymn.
Okay.
Let's choose a hymn from the psalm, the psalm, I forget what it's called, in the hymnal, at the very beginning in the hymnal, right? And I just pull my hymnal down from the shelf and I go, okay, which hymns are we going to focus on as a practice, as a devotional practice every day, right? We're going to do this every single day for 40 days. And that's what I ask all of my clients to do when they're engaged in spiritual, 40 days, right? And then we're going to see what changed, what happened, right? So, a hymn or a mantra chant. And then, there are also encouragement, if you will, of movement, body. So choose your flavor. Do you want to do yoga? Do you want to do Kundalini? Do you want to do 5 Tibetans? Do you want to do Gaga movement language? Do you want to walk? Do you want to run? Do you want to go to the gym? What is it? Move your body, right? Move the body. You must, right? You absolutely must. And then journaling is a spiritual practice. And I really encourage clients to journal. Have the journal with them so they can take notes, reflect back, have it with them, and whenever there's a part, boom, write it down.
Right.
It's really important to keep track of it. So those are the kind of things that I bring into a session from a spiritual standpoint. But the first, hi, how you doing? Well, I had this thing happen to me and okay, good. Let's go in. And is it okay just to be with that part? Let's just hang out with that part and see what's happening. And then the process begins.
Right.
The process begins. And so, there's a real dovetailing. A real dovetailing.
Yeah, I was in DC.
I don't know if that answered. Did that answer your question?
That answered my question. I was just thinking, I was in DC just a couple of weeks ago, and I could imagine just the driving coming into the session, just the traffic. I just thought, wow, you would need a few minutes to just change where you're at.
Yes.
And for instance, we could bounce off of that, because here's a scenario. I've come in, I've been in the traffic. I've come into a session and I say, oh, this person pulled in front of me and it made me, and you begin to ask my questions. Why was that upsetting to me? Because and we start to recognize the voice that these parts have, because there's a part of me that says, well,
yes,
he was trying to get ahead of me, or to recognize, I felt like this person, there was some injustice there, and we start to ask these questions, and it unfolds into this whole part of ourselves that has these ways of thinking, has these past experiences that have developed this way of thinking. And just by, when we don't really know why the person got in front of us, we really, really don't, but we sure have an answer right away. Our parts do, right? Our parts have an answer to that situation.
100%.
Yeah. So
Instantly.
instantly.
It's instant. How dare he cut me off? That SOB,
Yeah.
And I am insulted. I'm hurt. And, I mean, we get into this whole scenario in our head. Trust me when I tell you that when I first came up here to DC, I had lived in Florida and Los Angeles. Right, Miami and LA. The driving up here is a whole nother ball game.
It is,
and I would just get so worked up, and I'd go to my A meetings. I said, "What is it with the drivers around here?" And well, when you bring the world into the world capital, or nation's capital, the world resides here. You'll get every driver known to man, and over time. And working on myself, myself as my own client.
Yes.
One day I was driving along and I'm like, okay, let's do some pranayama here. We're not going to get exercised about these people cutting me off. So we're not doing some pranayama. Okay, so now I'm breathing in, breathing out. Okay, fine. And that was helpful, right? Mm-hmm. And then the next sort of level was, okay, I'm doing pranayama, but let me add, I'm going to do mantra. Right. So I'm going to chant mantra in the car as a prayer, just for myself, not to get exercised.
Right.
And then there was something else I did. I forget what, but it occurred to me one day, and it was very interesting. It was one of those incidences where, anyone would get like a little verklempt,
Right.
Like, what's up? Whole bunches of cars are converging for the toll.
Right.
Honking, don't cut in, And I was sitting there with my breathing and my mantra, and I'm looking around and I'm going, well, this is interesting. I've been focused on me. Mm-hmm. I'm going to breathe to calm myself. Mm-hmm. I am going to chant to calm myself. What if I stopped doing that and turned it to them? Why don't I extend that to them, right? So let me then extend to you a prayer, right? May you be calm. Another one, may you have some patience. May you have understanding. And someone clearly like freaked out. If something's happening in your life that's life-threatening or dire, may you be relieved, And all of a sudden, my entire driving experience changed.
Wow.
Completely.
Yeah.
100%.
Yeah.
Now the irritation is about this much. Oh, thanks for using your indicator. I've only been sitting here for 5 minutes waiting, then you decide to turn without the indicator. I said, thank you. Okay, I guess I was supposed to sit here for 5 minutes and exercise patience.
Right. The anxiety, the tension leaves. Yeah. It's different.
Right? Yeah. I got stuck. I was in an emergency situation. I had to get somewhere right fast. And I get in my car. I'm like hauling ass out of here. And boom, I'm behind a truck doing 30 in a 55.
Of course.
And I'm like, oh, okay, thank you. Whatever's up there, because if I had been left to my own devices, I probably would have done 70 in the 55 and God forbid hit an animal, have an accident, and wouldn't have been able to attend to an emergency. So thank you for this. I'm now sitting behind and I'm going slow because slow is okay. Right? Do you know that I got there the same amount of time? The time was no difference. So once clients have and I have many clients who have parts with the driving, it comes up a lot in sessions, right? Once we have sort of that resolution, that unburdening, that, whatever, I'll make the suggestions I just talked about. Would it be possible for your parts to say a prayer to someone, who is honking or, cutting you off? Could it be that they just had a fight with their wife? Could it be that their mother is dying in a hospital? Right. We start to, when we're coming from self, we are looking at the world through a very different lens.
Yes.
Really different lens,
Yes.
And I always, I don't jokingly say this. I say this with great sincerity. Can we imagine what it would be like to see through the eyes of God.
Mhm.
What would that be like? Or
Yeah.
the divine, whatever you want to call it, right? But to see through the eyes of the holiest concept or conception, right? Wow. We would see the world so differently. We would see our fellow man so differently, right?
And at the same time,
gratitude.
Yeah. And at the same time, you know, recognizing if I am having a hard time, what do I need? You know, what's going on with me?
Yes.
Like it's sending the prayer out, but it's also at the same time, when we get into that big self, we have the capacity for that compassion for others and for ourselves, you know, and sometimes if we could just say, what am I missing here? And sometimes I'll say, you know, and I recognize that there is this part of me that feels, maybe I feel like, you know, that part of you that feels like, oh, these things always happen to me, you know, like that kind of a feeling.
Yeah, that belief. Yes.
Yeah, that belief.
Right. Yeah.
And I think, okay, you know, oh, what do you need to feel like that's not true, you know, and ask myself, it kind of start to have this dialogue with other people or with myself, I mean, and then in a matter of just a moment, having that same kind of attitude toward other people just naturally. And it's a flow. It's a flow between them and me. And it's really, really special when you can understand that space of big S self and what that feels like and how powerful it is. It's so powerful, so much more powerful than that ego, you know, than the force of the ego.
Yeah. Yeah. And because the force of the ego is so destructive.
Right.
Right. And the force or the energy of the self is reparative, regenerative. It is infinite. It is an infinite resource within us. And, you know, I use the Dalai Lama as an analogy, Mother Teresa as an analogy, Martin Luther King, right? Desmond Tutu. These are individuals that walked on the face of the earth, and some still do. And you can just see they are in self, right?
There's enoughness for them and everyone else. Yeah, enough.
100%, right? Now, Mother Teresa was, you know, she was very bolshy. She could get into people's faces, you know, in the name of Jesus, right? And she was a fiery one, right?
Yeah.
Dalai Lama says, I get angry, but they're human, right? But they are in self more than in their parts.
Right.
And I think that's, you know, when people say, I don't understand, then I'll say, well, think of, you know, someone who you really admire. Was it Martin Luther King? Was it this one? You know, think of someone who really, Golda Meir, whoever, right? That you really feel was just like this beacon of light on the planet.
Yeah.
They were in self. And that's usually a good analogy for folks.
That is.
Yeah.
That is a good analogy. Yeah. Oh, I love it. Well, you know, we talk about the idea of wholeness and understanding becoming whole, I think very much fits in with IFS, with spirituality, of course. We deal with those kind of things all the time. But just what is your definition of wholeness? What does that mean to you?
So I often say that there is a place within where we are perfect, whole, and complete. Perfect, whole, and complete. That's the phrase I use. And of course, that's the self. But for me, wholeness means that I am in unity with my body, my mind, and my spirit. Right? And that there is a sense of, I don't want to use the word completion because that means an ending, but a sense of holding in energy and space that is at a vibrational level, right? So this can be driving in DC, right? Wholeness is like this. There's this, and for those who are listening, I'm shaking my hands for anxieties, right? And then there's just this soft, smooth movement within when we feel whole, right? When there's a wholeness. Wholeness for me is that I greet each morning, every single day, 4:30 a.m. I am up, right? And I greet the day literally with love in my heart, right? Welcome day, welcome right? And then I move through my day in that state of mind to the best of my ability. And when I go to bed at night and I review the day and I feel like it's been a complete, there's a completion to the day, right? Then I feel, there's a wholeness here, right? There's a wholeness here because I suited up, I showed up, I did the next right thing, no matter the personal consequences, right? I was kind, I was generous, I was compassionate, I was in flow most of the day, right? And all is well, all is well. I think wholeness is all is well, right?
Feel empowered every day with wholeness videos, meditations, downloads, classes, and more by joining the Wholeness Library at thewholenessnetwork.com.